I'm really intrigued about what it takes to become a good role model. I think men nowadays don't have a lot of good role models out there. We've got a lot of people that we look at and we hear from. And I'm speaking about specifically people on the right side. Let's look at people even like Andrew Tate. Men look at them and they hear a breath of fresh air because there really is something wrong with how men have been treated over the last couple of decades and where it's going. And then someone like Andrew Tate comes along and he's speaking half the truth. And so a lot of people listen to him and go, oh my gosh, he's the right person. But he's not a good role model. He's not a good role model because he's only speaking, as I say, half the truth. And I really think it's important for us to find out what actually is a good role model. Now, today, I'm going to do that by looking at some of the biggest role models of all time. And I'm going to also use some personal examples here. At least get this talk to find out how some of the people in my life could have even been better role models as well. So that's what we're going to do together. But first, we have to answer this big question, what actually makes a good role model? I can come out here and say I don't like people like Andrew Tate. But if I don't actually give you a good example of what is a better role model, then what is the point, right? So let's look at the biggest role models of all time. The biggest role models of all time I can imagine. Let's pull a couple out of the hat. Let's go someone like Steve Jobs and let's go someone like Nelson Mandela. What makes them a good role model? Now, you'd probably argue, or I know some people would argue, that it would be the person themselves, the character that you are. But I don't think that's the case. Let's have a look at Steve Jobs. Not a lot of people thought that he was an amazing person. At least that's not what you know about him, right? When you think of Steve Jobs, you don't think, oh my gosh, he's such a lovely guy. In actual fact, a lot of people think he's a little bit of a jerk, or he was a little bit of a jerk. Okay, so not necessarily the person. Well, what about Nelson Mandela? The interesting thing about Nelson Mandela is he's passed away, and what stays is not necessarily, again, the character. Something else is sticking. I bet you probably don't even remember specific characteristics of Nelson Mandela, except for maybe his voice. And that's a superficial characteristic at best. So it's not necessarily his courage or his tenacity or whatever. That's not the thing that we remember both of these men for. What do we remember them for? Number one was Steve Jobs. I believe we idolize and we look up to Steve Jobs as a role model, especially in the entrepreneur space, because he was somebody that had a vision, a dream, a goal. He wanted to make things beautiful, or he wanted to make beautiful things. He wanted to use design in ways that people hadn't done before. He had ideas about what he wanted to create, and he went about and did them. Ooh, I have this idea, I'm going to go create it. Nelson Mandela, what did he want to do? Well, he wanted to free South Africa from apartheid. He wanted to create equality in South Africa. Now, these two things that are similar between these two men are purpose, drive. I want to achieve something. Do you see, that's my point here. What makes a good role model is actually purpose. What's the purpose? What are you pulling people along for? And that's why I honestly believe we need better role models of today. If we look at Andrew Tate, what is his purpose? If you look at Donald Trump, what is his purpose? Again, I'm not saying this specifically we need to be against these men, but I just believe that they are men that come here and help inspire a lot of men of today. But I think it's half truth. They're not the best role models. So what's stopping men from having role models? And more to the point, how can we have role models within our lives that are not just these outside forces, outside things? We need to have role models that we can also have within our families, within our friend circles. So I want to go through and give you two concrete examples of people that were in my life. So first things first, I actually was quite lucky with my life in that I had two father figures. One was my actual father. I lived with him until I was 7 years old, and then I saw him once a year until he passed away. And my grandfather was 4 years older. Now, I didn't live with him when I was young. He was actually in Australia, but when I moved to Australia when I was 7 years old, I would spend quite a lot of time with my grandfather on my mother's side. Interestingly, these men were only 4 years apart, but they were vastly different, and they taught me a lot about a lot of things. But the one very interesting thing about these two men is, although they had wonderful opportunities to become the best role models for me, they both are not men that I want to be like. They're both not role models, and I think I've worked out why. And I think this is going to help us answer how we can have better role models in our society. So number one, let's look at my father. My father's name was Marcello, an Italian man. Really, I love my father, and it still pains me. It's the biggest pain I've ever had in my life was his loss and his death. But I love my father. He was a really good businessman, as in he ran a successful company. It was about 150 employees. But the interesting thing about this company was that it was never a company that my father actually wanted to run himself. In fact, his mother was the one who told him he should start the company, and he started it with his brother and his father to give his father a job. Now, once his father passed away and his brother moved out of the company, he'd already had us, his kids, and so he stayed running this company so that he could support us. His whole life was supporting people with this company. You know, this is great. That is an admirable thing, and I'm very, very grateful for Dad for that. There's only one problem. It's not what he wanted to do. So my father would always talk about designing homes, designing houses. He had one opportunity in his life to design a house, and it was one of an investment property that he actually designed himself. He spoke about this with such passion and almost like a wish, when I retire or one day I'll do it. But he never did. And the interesting thing is I realized then, my dad did actually have a purpose. So remember how I was talking about purposes earlier? My dad had a purpose, but he never lived that purpose. So I believe he had a purpose not lived. Now, a purpose not lived is difficult because it's actually a lot easier than not actually having a purpose, because you kind of just have to have the courage to live your own purpose, right? And that's the difficulty here. You have to drop everything. Now, for some people, what you have to drop might seem counterintuitive. So the reason why I say this is my father and I used to talk every Friday night. It was lovely. I was in Australia, he was in South Africa, we'd be on the phone. And when we'd speak, I'd talk to my father about everything, about life, about what I wanted to do. And my father would tell me, Alessandro, you should just go and do what your heart says. You should go and become a singer, an actor, a filmmaker, whatever you want to do, go do it. But the interesting thing was I never believed my father because my father didn't do it himself. And so therefore he was never a role model for these things. It's all very well and good to say, go and follow your dreams. But if you don't follow your dreams yourself, how can you speak about it? How can you be trusted with that? You can't. You're not even believed. I didn't believe him. In actual fact, as much as my father wanted us to follow our dreams, I felt like when we did, there was almost a slightest bit of jealousy. Yeah. So I'm grateful for my father setting me and my brother up, great, but it didn't make him a good role model, not at all. And if we're honest here, if you have a purpose not lived, right, and you just tell other people how to live their purpose, fine, you might be doing something for society in terms of providing for them, great, but you actually rob them of doing it for themselves, and you rob them of being able to see what actual purpose is and looks like. So we need better role models that say they're going to do something. They say they are going to be someone, and then they go about and do it. You need to have the courage to live your purpose. Otherwise, you'll end up someone like my dad, who worked every single day in a business he didn't really love until the day he died. And as grateful as I am for him, that doesn't make him role model material. So let's have a look at the next father figure. Got my grandfather. My granddad was a very different man. So where my father was kind, my grandfather was tough. Well, not even was, he is tough. He's still alive. And my grandfather was born in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. And then he moved to South Africa. And the interesting thing about my grandfather, he also was in the army. He's one of those men that sort of just claims that he could do anything. I could do this. I could do that. I should have done this. A lot of shoulds, coulds, and woulds in my granddad's speech. And I really think a lot of these shoulds, coulds, and woulds of a tough man mask the fact I didn't have a purpose at all. My granddad actually said to me, I would have been South Africa's best Formula One driver if I never met your grandmother. I would have been the best mechanic if I never had your mother. I would have been the best teacher if I never insert whatever there. And I honestly think this blaming, this looking outside for answers genuinely is there to mask the fact that he had not found a purpose. And that's pretty daunting for a tough man. It's pretty daunting because you have to actually have some humility here to go, I don't know the answers. And yet I don't think those were ever words that my grandfather had ever said. I don't know the answers. He was always somebody who knew all the answers and yet had never actually done any of it for himself. So humility here is a big one. But let me tell you how important humility is. There's another member of my family who was actually in a similar position, right? Had not found their purpose. And this is my grandfather's daughter, my mother. My mother was 43 years old. She was walking with me on the beach one day. She said, Alessandro, I don't know why I'm here. Now, she was very depressed at this point. It was a real low point in her life. She'd just gone through her second divorce, and then she was with another guy, and then the guy and her didn't pan out, and she was having financial issues. Her back was hurting. She didn't want to be a massage therapist for any longer. She saw me, her son, who was always somebody who lived with purpose. I've always been somebody who, whenever I do something, I do it with all intensity. I was singing and then I was acting, then I was doing filmmaking. She saw me doing this and she's like, Alessandra, I don't have what you have, this purpose or a life of this. What do I do? What am I even here for? Now, the interesting thing was, if that was my granddad would never even admit that. One, tough men don't do that. They don't admit these sort of things. But my mother did. Then she took my advice, which is, again, another thing a tough man wouldn't do. And I said to her, why don't you make it your purpose to find your purpose? You're 43, why not, right? And the final thing that she did humility-wise was she actually took that advice. Instantly, her and I started something called Passion Project, where we interviewed 10 women about their purpose. Then my mother loved meeting up with these women and started something called Soul Sundays. These Soul Sundays were just a group of women who all did one thing each for each other. And then she would do tarot readings for these women. And the tarot readings for these women, somebody's like, oh, I really love that. Can I pay you for one? Mom was like, wow, getting paid to do a tarot reading. That's really cool. And then she thought, well, if I get paid for one, maybe I could get paid for other ones. So she started doing tarot readings in those psychic halls or things like that at a fair. Little bit by little bit, she did it more and more and more. And then one day she's like, oh, Alessandra, I'm going to give up massage and I'm just going to do readings. Great, right? That was really good. But she's like, I need a little bit more exposure. Let me jump on TikTok. And I told her a little strategy. I said, just put a card in front of your face while you're doing these readings and say, comment your name for a reading. She did that every single day for many years. And now 10 years after that point, I think she's 53 now, she has 1.3 million followers on TikTok. And so I look at that, I look at the story from my mother. She had no purpose. She even claimed it herself. And then I look at her father, who still to this day blames other people, why would I want to do that? I wouldn't want to do, sour grapes. And there's just no humility, not a shred of humility there. Not a shred of I don't know what's going on. And the beautiful thing of when you say I don't know what's going on or I don't know the next step is you allow the answer to come in. That's the beautiful thing of actually saying those words. I don't know. You open the door for the knowing to come in. That's the reason why you need to do that. That's the reason why. It's not so somebody can laugh at you, whatever the fuck you think it is. It's literally this. I don't know allows the door of knowing to come in. So get to the I don't know as quick as possible, because then you understand and you identify the thing you need to know, right? So my granddad's saying, I know all the answers. He'll never live a life of purpose, ever, because he knows all the answers. But he doesn't know all the answers. So he doesn't allow the door to open for the answers. So that's why he's not a good role model at all. You can be the toughest of men in the world, but unless you genuinely have the humility to claim what you don't know, you're not a smart or knowledgeable person. You can't become that. Can't ever become that. So I look at these two role models, or people that should be role models in my life, and I really just look at how they can become better role models is if, at least my father, right? He lived his purpose, had the courage to live his purpose. And if you don't have a purpose yet, you have the humility to admit that. The humility to open the door for knowledge to come in. And that's what I believe makes a good role model. And how we branch that out to society. Well, first thing to realize is that there are no silver linings. We cannot make anyone else a better role model. There's no one out there that we can go, ooh, I want Andrew Tate to be a better person. It won't happen. But what can we do? I'm very interested in the solutions here. We can't change anyone in the past. We can't assume the future is going to be better. We need to be the better role models ourselves by living lives of purpose. That is the number one motive or drive for males, is to find a purpose and live it. So if there is something in you today that you are like, oh, I have been thinking about doing this, but I don't have the courage to do it. However you find that courage, go and do it. And if you have the humility, let me rephrase that. If you don't know what your purpose is yet, find the humility to say it. Do not claim that this is the way that life is and blame other people for the situation you're in. Take responsibility, have the humility and say, I don't know what the fuck I am here for. Because the moment you do that, the moment you claim that, the moment you say that, you will open that door. And then you will find down the road, you will literally start to find, oh my gosh, I have become a good role model. I am now a role model for other people. That is the only thing you can change. And I hope you do, because we need better role models, especially for men today.